It's easy to forget now, but just a decade ago, the New York Giants were one of the more highly regarded franchises in the NFL, and as a fan of the team myself, I felt the same way. It just felt like the Giants organization had the infrastructure to always remain competitive, sort of like Baltimore, Pittsburgh, or Green Bay. But as we sit here over a decade later, those Giants are unrecognizable. Since the start of 2017, the Giants are 40, 91, and 1. This includes 7 double-digit loss seasons and the worst record in the entire NFL over that span. You start to wonder, how did this once highly thought of franchise turn into such a dumpster fire? Well, we're gonna try and answer that today. This may take a while, so enjoy the show. I truly believe this is where the demise of this once great franchise first started. It was the end of the 2015 season. The Giants had just come off their third straight losing season, now 4 years removed from their last Super Bowl. 2015 for the Giants was remembered for high-scoring games and heartbreaking losses. So essentially, their offense was really good, borderline elite, but their defense was arguably the worst in the NFL. Between the blown leads, the fourth quarter collapses, and now 4 straight seasons of underachieving, the Giants made the decision to fire Tom Coughlin, their 2-time Super Bowl winning head coach. Now you would think, given the 4 years of losing and the defensive personnel being absolutely atrocious, that would mean they fired the general manager too. Well, they didn't. Jerry Reese, who had his fingerprints all over the past 2 Super Bowls, just finished his 10th season as the Giants general manager, and apparently was staying for his 11th season. This decision apparently enraged Tom Coughlin, to the point where he wouldn't even look Giants owner John Mara in the eye when walking off the podium for one last time. And we'll get to John Mara later, trust me, because he may be the most responsible for this organization's downfall. This clip right here is where the phrase Giants pride no longer existed, in my opinion. Sure, it was a rocky start for Coughlin the first couple of years, but at this point he was loved, well respected, accomplished, and the veterans on the team really seemed to like him. You could literally see Eli Manning fighting back tears during his exit interview. But on they went, with Jerry Reese on one last leg and soon to hire a new head coach. Coincidentally, the rival Philadelphia Eagles had a head coaching vacancy as well, and they were looking to poach off the Giants staff. One name they were going to interview was Tom Coughlin. The other was young offensive coordinator Ben McAdoo. McAdoo spent his past 2 seasons with New York, calling offensive plays, and honestly helped rejuvenize Eli Manning's career. The Giants really did not want to lose either of these guys to the Eagles. They couldn't really control what Coughlin had done because they had fired him, but luckily for them, Coughlin pulled his name out of the running. So what could John Mara and the Giants do to prevent McAdoo from leaving for the Eagles? You panic and make him the head coach of your team instead. Yup, that's literally what they did. The 38-year-old McAdoo had a second meeting set up with Philly, but the Giants moved quickly to ensure that would not happen. So there you have it. Ben McAdoo became the 17th head coach in Giants history, and now gets to work with a GM he's familiar with. All is good and well. Now let me put the viewer in a hypothetical situation here. Let's say you are a GM of an underachieving football team, you have an impatient owner, and you know that one more bad season will almost certainly get you fired. Do you A, spend money wisely and do what's best for the team's future, or B, do you give out the most guaranteed money in free agency by far and throw most of that on defensive players? Jerry Reese, as expected with his job on the line, went out and spent like a drunken sailor. Can't necessarily blame him when ownership wanted a quick fix, and the best way to do that was to irresponsibly overspend in free agency. So 2016 happens, and for the most part it went really well. The team went 11-5 on the back of their upgraded defense, and most importantly, they made the playoffs. Then comes another unfortunate event, the infamous boat picture. The Giants head to Green Bay, they drop a bunch of passes, allow a Hail Mary before halftime, stare at a live fumble, run out of bounds at the 3-yard line on a kickoff. It was awful, but a game that the organization had to put behind them. While 2016's success was able to buy Jerry Reese yet another year, the 2017 season was not nearly as kind. They did sign late career Brandon Marshall and drafted Evan Engram in the first round to help a now 36-year-old Eli Manning, who showed his first signs of decline in 2016. The 2017 Giants were projected to win 9 games this season, but only got a third of the way there. A decimated wide receiver room, players quitting on the field, locker room beef, and bad coaching were one of the many things that the 2017 Giants could not overcome. But rather than biting the bullet and admitting their mistakes, the 2017 season was one that would end up setting the Giants back for years. After a 2-9 start, the Giants benched Eli Manning in favor of Geno Smith. While the organization would allow Manning to start games to preserve his consecutive game streak, Eli Manning was not interested. Now here is where the New York media can can really hurt you because the backlash of this move was insane. Whether it was former players, Tom Coughlin, radio personalities, or even the national media, the Giants were getting crucified throughout the week. It was so bad that less than a week later, John Mara made the decision to fire Ben McAdoo and Jerry Reese mid-season. And John Mara knew about the decision to bench Eli Manning in the first place. And it was very unlike the Giants to do this. It had actually been 41 years since they fired a head coach mid-season. Now, while I can acknowledge that Eli Manning was a franchise legend and should be a first ballot Hall of Famer, his time of being a franchise quarterback was clearly over. Anybody being honest with themselves could have seen that. But here's where the Giants' inability to move on and make the tough decisions really comes into play. They enter the 2018 offseason looking for a new GM and a new head coach. Whether they want to admit it or not, there was essentially a mandate from ownership that the next regime had to build around Eli Manning. And Eli Manning that was now 37 years old and 3 years removed from last playing at an elite level. Like any job candidate would do, you tell the person interviewing you what they want to hear. And who better to get the general manager job than somebody who already had ties with the Giants organization and still believed in Eli Manning? Meet Dave Gettleman. Gettleman, now in his second stint with the Giants, was officially hired on December 28th, 2017. And he, like John Mara, ended up being one of the key components as to why the organization remained incompetent. The warning signs were there with Gettleman right away. He spent 5 seasons as the Carolina Panthers GM, and even during his time there, he rubbed some well-respected veterans the wrong way, including Steve Smith and D'Angelo Williams. The Giants then hired Vikings offensive coordinator Pat Shurmur to be their next head coach. Shurmur was once a head coach for the Cleveland Browns, but after 9 wins in 2 seasons, he found himself being a coordinator once again. But who better to hire to revive Eli Manning's career than a guy who just got to the NFC Championship with Case Keenum as his quarterback? As stated earlier, the plan was to make Eli great again, and their 2018 offseason moves reflected that. Gettleman even cherry-picked one of Eli's few good games in 2017 as a reason to believe he still had something left in the tank. If what I saw against Philadelphia was not a mirage, and I don't believe it was, then we'll just keep moving. Oh, and the best part was, this general manager watched his film on a Nintendo Wii. You would think this was like an SNL skit or something, but this was sadly the new norm for a franchise that was quickly losing its identity. As I was getting to, the 2018 offseason saw the Giants add 3 new offensive linemen, including a fat $62 million contract for Nate Solder to play left tackle. They signed some more washed veterans that offseason, looking to cash in on one last NFL check, including William Gay, Connor Barwin, and Jonathan Stewart. Another moronic Gettleman quote was him saying that Jonathan Stewart had not lost a step when his yards per carry had literally been declining for 4 years straight.
Jonathan Stewart's in his 10th year, and he's hardly lost anything.
This man even went out of his way to mock analytics when talking about the running back position being devalued.
And like I said, I think a lot of that's nonsense. I think it's someone who had this idea and got into the analytics of it and did all these running backs and went through the whatever.
And as we know 7 years later, literally every NFL team is heavy into analytics. Some more than others, but still, this is a horrible soundbite from Dinosaur Dave who was stuck in his old ways. And then we get to the infamous draft night of 2018. The Giants held the 2nd overall pick coming off a 3-13 season. Now with a diminished 37-year-old quarterback and the Giants picking 2nd in a draft where 5 quarterbacks went in the first round, you would have to think the Giants picked one of those 5, right? Okay, well they didn't. But you have to imagine they traded back to acquire more assets. Oh no, they did not do that either. It actually was reported that Dave Gettleman was so stubborn, he literally ignored phone calls from other teams looking to acquire the Giants' 2nd overall pick. This alone should have been a fireable offense. But as I said earlier, their mission was to make Eli Manning great again. And in order to help do that, the Giants selected Penn State running back Saquon Barkley with the 2nd overall pick. While Barkley was an elite prospect, and we saw what he could do on a great team 7 years later, you just don't take that position 2nd overall with a 37-year-old quarterback on your roster. In hindsight, the Giants passed on Sam Darnold, Josh Allen, and Lamar Jackson in favor of Saquon. Gettleman described Saquon as a prospect so good he was, quote, touched by the hand of God. But with Gettleman stuck in his ways, he really did not understand the diminished value of the running back position in the year 2018. Other teams were aware of it, and no running back has been drafted higher than than 8th overall since. To no surprise, this 2018 MEGA Giants team did not fare so well. The team started 1-7, the free agent signings were trash, the defense was still atrocious, and Eli Manning looked decent at best. But hey, at least Saquon Barkley looked good. They did win 4 out of 5 games in the middle of the year, but lost their last 3, ending the season at 5-11. It was a massive letdown for an organization fixated on making things work around Eli for one last time. But at this point, even John Mara and Dave Gettleman knew and accepted reality that this team needed to find their quarterback of the future. During 2018, it was reported that Dave Gettleman attended at least 6 of Justin Herbert's games at Oregon. He was clearly a big fan. But once Herbert unexpectedly returned to school for his senior season, the Giants were left with their pants down, looking for another quarterback prospect they could latch onto. The Giants had some other options in the draft, including Dwayne Haskins, who definitely expressed interest in playing for New York. However, thanks to Pat Shurmur's scouting and Dave Gettleman slobbering over a Senior Bowl performance, the Giants had their eyes peeled on another quarterback prospect. This time it was Daniel Jones from Duke University. This really would have been the most Giants thing ever. You miss out on Justin Herbert, you fall in love with a guy over a Senior Bowl performance, and force a first-round quarterback pick because you start to feel your seat getting warm. And yes, it definitely helped that the coach of Duke football, David Cutcliffe, had a relationship with Eli Manning. And yes, it definitely helped that Daniel Jones had the same mannerisms as Eli Manning. So on draft night of 2019, the Giants did the unthinkable and drafted Daniel Jones 6th overall. It created some of the most hilarious draft reaction videos of all time, but the Giants were confident in their decision. It was the classic "I'm the smartest guy in the room" pick by the condescending Dave Gettleman. They also traded back up in the first round that night to select cornerback DeAndre Baker out of Georgia. Baker was not only awful as a rookie, but that would end up being his only year as a Giant. Baker in the following summer was charged with 4 accounts of armed robbery with a firearm and was eventually released. Another massive move they made that offseason was trading star wide receiver Odell Beckham to Cleveland just 1 year after signing a 5-year, $95 million deal to stay a Giant. To Gettleman's credit, one of those picks he got back from Beckham turned into Dexter Lawrence. So in the end, a positive move, despite trading the team's most popular player. But fear not, because they would sign 30-year-old slot wide receiver Golden Tate to a 4-year deal instead. The 2019 expectations for the Giants were pretty low to begin with, but it probably ended up being worse than what ownership had hoped for. Eli Manning was benched just after 2 games, which led us to the start of the Daniel Jones era. Jones's rookie season was highlighted by his debut comeback victory versus Tampa, beating up on bad teams, and an excessive amount of turnovers. The season had somewhat of a feel-good ending, with Eli Manning winning his final start at home versus Miami. And regarding Eli one more time, the Giants quite frankly kept him for 2 years too long. If they had just been honest with themselves and evaluated the quarterback position during 2017 or 2018's drafts, there's no telling what could have been different. I'm sure most of us are aware now, but Ben McAdoo, the former head coach of the Giants, was enamored with Patrick Mahomes and was actually very upset when the Giants could not trade up to get Mahomes in 2017. If 2018 wasn't the Make Eli Great Again tour, do they end up selecting Darnold or Allen? Not being able to make the tough decision when it's necessary is a sign of a poorly run organization. The Giants opted to fire Pat Shurmur after just 2 seasons. It's been said that Giants co-owner Steve Tisch was the one unsatisfied and pushing for Shurmur's firing, but did that mean they also let go of the GM who came in with Pat Shurmur? No, of course not. Dave Gettleman remained to quote-unquote finish what he started, and the Giants for the second time in 5 years allowed a general manager to stay on staff while making the head coach the scapegoat. The search for yet another head coach was on, and they interviewed 8 candidates to find the 21st head coach in Giants history. The candidate most people wanted was Baylor's Matt Rule. It's been reported that the Giants had a chance to match the Panthers' offer for Matt Rule, which was 7 years, $62 million, but to their credit, they wisely passed on that. They had interest in Mike McCarthy as well, but he ended up in Dallas. The man they hired for the job was probably the least expected, and I still remember being floored when I got this notification. They went with Patriots special teams coordinator Joe Judge. Now, as you can tell from the Gettleman hire, the Daniel Jones, Eli Manning connection, the Giants love familiarity and people they are comfortable with. Of course, Bill Belichick, who had spent 12 years with the Giants staff during the 80s, spoke very highly of Joe Judge, and John Mara bought what he was selling. The Athletic reported that John Mara was blown away by Judge's 3-hour interview, calling it the best he's been a part of since Nick Saban met with the Giants in 1997. Joe Judge was super impressive at his introductory press conference, and for the first time in a while, the Giants fan base had hope. And while it's sad but true, this 2020 offseason was the Giants' best offseason in the Dave Gettleman era. They were able to sign Blake Martinez and James Bradberry in free agency for good value, and nailed their first 2 picks of the draft with Andrew Thomas and Xavier McKinney. However, like most recent seasons, the Giants got off to a horrific start. This time they found themselves 1-7 after 8 weeks. And to make matters worse, Saquon Barkley tore his ACL early in week 2, putting a quick end to his 3rd season in the NFL. The new offense under Jason Garrett, as compared to Pat Shurmur, drastically declined. And with that, we witnessed a step backwards in Daniel Jones' development. He was less turnover prone, but really did not improve in any other area. As they were accustomed to doing, the Giants went on their random mid-season win streak, getting their record back to 5-7. During the season's final week, the Giants beat the Cowboys, improving to 6-10. They actually had a shot of making the playoffs and winning the NFC East, which had an atrocious year overall, but as we know, the Eagles pulled the shameless tank, and the Commanders won the division with 7 wins. But honestly, this was probably the best thing for the Giants. The last thing they needed was a false sense of confidence of being a contending team, when in reality, they were not really that close. Through the first 3 years of Dave Gettleman, the Giants boasted a 15-33 record. To any person looking at this through an objective lens, he would be fired by now. But owner John Mara once again remained loyal to the wrong people and decided to retain the general manager for a 4th year. Mara explained that he enjoyed the way Gettleman and Joe Judge worked together during their first year and didn't really see a benefit in making a change. Just like Jerry Reese in 2016, Gettleman became paranoid. Gettleman became paranoid that this could be his last offseason to prove himself. Much like his predecessor, Gettleman made the decision to spend wildly during 2021's free agency period. While this tends to backfire in general, it was even more reckless to execute this in 2021 due to the league's salary cap number plummeting due to COVID. In most off seasons, that cap number goes up, but due to the weird circumstances, a team's cap space was more limited. The Giants ended up spending $174 million combined on Leonard Williams, Kenny Golladay, and Adoree Jackson. The Kenny Golladay contract was a high-risk, high-reward type of move, especially with Golladay missing over half the season the year prior with a hip injury. Other money was spent on some washed-up old players like Kyle Rudolph, Devontae Booker, Reggie Ragland, and Danny Shelton. And as stated earlier, giving out money to free agents well past their prime was Gettleman's specialty. In the first round of the 2021 draft, Dave Gettleman had done something he had never done in his first 8 years of being a GM, and that was trade back in the draft. The Chicago Bears approached the Giants with an intriguing offer to trade up for Justin Fields, and the Giants took it. New York now had the Bears' first-round pick in the following draft and dropped back to 20th overall in this current draft. On the downside though, the Giants trading back did have them passing up on some talented players, including Micah Parsons and Rashawn Slater. With the 20th overall pick, which formerly belonged to the Bears, the Giants selected wide receiver Kadarius Toney out of Florida, a human joystick type of receiver who was tough to bring down, although he did have his concerns like route running and contested catches. And there were some off-field issues. You would think that Gettleman learned from the DeAndre Baker experience just 2 years prior, but they believe that this time would be different. To Toney's credit, he did not end up getting in trouble with the law, but he was not the easiest player to deal with either. And as for the rest of the 2021 class, it was atrocious. Azeez Ojulari was the only player to make any sort of long-term impact, and even he has missed 22 games in his first 4 seasons dealing with numerous injuries. 2021 was not only a big year for Gettleman, who was obviously fighting to keep his job, but it was also crucial for 2019's first-round quarterback Daniel Jones, who was entering a pivotal year 3 after a disappointing year 2. The Giants really did all they could to place weapons around Jones: Kenny Golladay, Kadarius Toney, Sterling Shepard, Evan Engram, Kyle Rudolph, and Saquon Barkley. It was good content for one of those "who's stopping this offense" graphics, but that was about it sadly. Like most Giants seasons, 2021 started off poorly. After an 0-3 start, the Giants pulled off a big overtime win in New Orleans, which was probably the high point of their season. Kenny Golladay had his best game as a Giant, John Ross scored a long touchdown, and so did Saquon Barkley. But from that point on, things just got worse and worse. Injuries piled up, especially on offense, whether it was Saquon, Toney, Golladay, Andrew Thomas, and even Daniel Jones. Jones ended up playing his last game of the season in Week 12's win versus the Eagles. In the final 6 games of 2021, the Giants honestly put out the most dreadful and embarrassing football I could ever imagine watching. They ended the year 0-6, averaging 9.3 points per game, and were outscored 163-56 over the final 6 games. As bad as things things were, it sounded like John Mara was on board to bring back Joe Judge for a third year. With 4 games left in the season, an article was released saying that John Mara thought he found his next Bill Parcells or Bill Belichick, and was extremely confident in Joe Judge long term. So barring Judge royally fucking up over the next 4 games, he was going to be back with the Giants for 2022. And what did he do instead? He went on an 11-minute rant after a 29-3 loss against the Bears and gave us some hilarious sound bites in the process.
If you're in the damn building, you walk on through our locker room, you ain't seeing that crap you saw before. You ain't seeing guys right now planning vacations. You ain't seeing golf clubs in front of players' locker. You ain't seeing that stuff.
And of course, in the final game of the season, there were the back-to-back quarterback sneaks on 2nd and 3rd down. To John Mara's credit, though, he did the right thing for once here. With Dave Gettleman's quote-unquote retirement, aka you're fired for the destruction over the past 4 years, Mara did the logical thing and wanted to pair a GM with a head coach of his choosing. Joe Judge was let go after just 2 seasons, when just 3 weeks prior, all reports pointed to him coming back. And I still believe till this day that the bullying from the media and the Giants fan base helped influence this decision. John Mara still believed in Joe Judge. As for Gettleman's retirement, he received a graceful send-off in the final week of the season, despite the team being an abysmal 19-46 under his watch. Now mind you, Jerry Reese, the GM who actually helped the team win 2 Super Bowls, was canned mid-season and had no graceful send-off. For those keeping track, this was now 3 head coaches for the Giants in a row who failed to make it past 2 seasons. By this point, the franchise that was once well respected by most had completely lost its way. As stated earlier, the Giants loved hiring people they were familiar with. Many speculated that once Gettleman retired, the Giants would promote from within. The belief was that their vice president of football operations, Kevin Abrams, would be Gettleman's successor. By this point, Giants fans were fed up with the process of ownership. They had not hired a GM from outside of their organization since George Young in 1979. And even then, it was the NFL commissioner at the time who essentially forced the Giants organization to hire Young due to their incompetence over the past decade. So would the Giants willingly hire an outside GM this time around? That was the real question. In most cases, the Giant way would be to promote Abrams, who had been with the organization for over 20 years. But shockingly, this time around, they did the responsible thing and had a real interview process and interviewed highly touted names from across the league. Names like Joe Ortiz from the Ravens, Adam Peters from the Niners, Ryan Poles from the Chiefs, and Joe Schoen from the Bills. The job was narrowed down to Peters versus Schoen. On January 21st, 2022, the Giants named Joe Schoen as their 7th general manager in team history. Next came the hiring of their new head coach, which would be their 4th new head coaching hire in the last 7 years. Exactly 1 week after hiring Schoen, they made the decision to hire Bills offensive coordinator Brian Daboll. Daboll was one of the better candidates out there, and with Joe Schoen also coming from the Bills organization, it made all the sense in the world. Knowing the Giants, something had to go wrong. They couldn't just have a sound process and everything goes smoothly. And just a few days after this hire, the Brian Flores story happened. I won't go into too many details, but this led Brian Flores suing the Giants for racial discrimination during their hiring process, and Bill Belichick making a common old person trying to send a text message mistake. On the bright side though, it looked like the Giants made 2 good hires here. The first year of this regime was supposed to be a wasted season, as they cleaned up the mess left by Dave Gettleman over the past 4 years. To save money, they had to release players like James Bradbury, Logan Ryan, and Kyle Rudolph. They were not afforded the luxury of going out and spending big in free agency due to their salary cap restraints. Their biggest free agent signing that first offseason was right guard Mark Lewinsky for a 3-year, $18 million deal. Another important move they made that first offseason was declining Daniel Jones' 5th-year option. It was going to be a prove-it year for the 4th-year quarterback, coming off back-to-back disappointing seasons. In Joe Schoen's first draft, he was gifted with 2 picks in the top 7 overall, thanks to the trade pulled off by Dave Gettleman with the Bears a year prior. With picks number 5 and 7 in the draft, the Giants came away with Kayvon Thibodeau and Evan Neal, 2 prospects who at one point in time each had their name in conversations to be the 1st overall pick. Many, myself included, thought thought the Giants had a flawless day one of the draft. The rest of Joe Schoen's first draft was a bit puzzling. He would spend the next few picks taking guys much earlier than they were projected to go. With the 2022 season set to begin, the Giants' win total was placed at 6.5, so clearly expectations were low. However, this overachieving Giants team found themselves at 6 wins just 7 weeks into the season. Most were thrilling wins that came down to the wire, and their defense under new defensive coordinator Don Martindale was consistently holding teams to under 20 points. And offensively, the rushing attack with Saquon Barkley and Daniel Jones was top 5 in the NFL in rushing that season. Lost in all this was the Giants trading their former first-round pick from a year prior for just a third-round pick. Kadarius Toney had become a big distraction, and they were more than ready to move on. Although they ended 2022 going 2-5-1, the Giants shockingly clinched their first playoff berth since 2016. In wildcard weekend, they drew a matchup with the 13-win Vikings in Minnesota. The Giants came in as slight underdogs, but there seemed to be more people picking them to win despite that. Daniel Jones and the offense scored 31 points, and the defense did just enough to come away with the organization's first playoff win since Super Bowl 46. Jones, in the midst of his contract year, showed up when it mattered, putting together one of the better playoff performances you'll see from a quarterback. Context included, though, the Vikings did have the 31st ranked pass defense that season. Sadly, the Cinderella run came to a crashing halt a week later against the division rival Eagles. The Giants looked outmatched on both sides of the ball, and the game was basically over by halftime. Enduring a playoff loss to that magnitude is tough, especially to the Eagles, but for a team projected 6.5 wins in August, they greatly overachieved in year one of this new regime. And at this point in time, it felt like the Giants finally got it right. I even made a video about this. It felt as if the incompetence was over and they were going to consistently win again. They had the head coach in place, they had the general manager, and the roster seemed just a few pieces away. The 2023 offseason was going to be a big one for this team. Clearly, the success of 2022 was going to accelerate the rebuild, and it felt like Joe Schoen bought into the hype himself. The 2023 offseason conundrum was that the team's two biggest pieces offensively were free agents during the same offseason, Saquon Barkley and Daniel Jones. As we know, a team can only use the franchise for one player per offseason, so tagging both was impossible. Essentially, Joe Schoen had to make a long-term commitment to one guy and franchise tag the other, or he could let one of them test the market if they were comfortable doing that. The Giants had until March 7th at 4 p.m. to make this decision. It was March 7th at 3:50 p.m., just 10 minutes before the deadline, and still no decision was made for either player. Let's just say that Daniel Jones' agency took Joe Schoen to the cleaners. According to Albert Breer, Jones called owner John Mara the same day of the deadline, hoping to get a deal done, and literally 4 minutes before the deadline, they came to an agreement. Jones signed a 4-year deal for $160 million and $92 million guaranteed. For Saquon Barkley, he was franchise tagged on a 1-year commitment worth $10 million guaranteed. The Jones contract is really where this regime lost me. It seemed like everything they were doing before this had reasoning and they were responsible, but this really defied all logic. And as a fan, I was very against it. I felt like I had seen enough over the first 4 years from Daniel Jones to know what he is, and this just felt like a massive overpay. I'm the last guy to want to commit to a running back long term, but in this case, it made more sense to extend Barkley and just tag Jones. And the numbers were there from Jones's 2022 quote-unquote breakout season to know that it was a bit fluky. It wasn't just the 15 passing touchdowns, but thanks to a very informative article by Warren Sharp, you can see where Daniel Jones ranked during the 2022 season out of 47 quarterbacks in different advanced stats, and the numbers here are not that pretty. So with the Giants handing out $160 million to their dink and dunk specialist, the expectations were now heightened, and the goal, according to Joe Schoen, was to close the gap with other teams in their division like Dallas and Philly. Schoen tried making improvements to the roster, like trading the 3rd-round pick they acquired for Kadarius Toney and sending that to the Raiders for tight end Darren Waller, a somewhat low-risk yet high-reward move, although the likelihood of this working out was very low due to injuries and age. And in free agency, they signed Colts linebacker Bobby Okereke to an affordable deal. The start of 2023 could not have gone any worse, and in the opinion of some Giants fans, their season ended on the first drive of the season. The offense did a good job marching down the field, but a blocked field goal by Dallas was the beginning of an eventual 40-0 shutout by the Cowboys. The Giants would start 1-5. Daniel Jones looked so bad that Brian Daboll Vrabel was throwing tablets at him, and on top of it, Jones tore his ACL in week 9. But the good news was there was a historic quarterback class on the horizon. Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Drake May, and more were all expected to be in the 2024 draft class. In typical Giants fashion though, they found a way to beat the Commanders and Patriots in back-to-back weeks, improving to 4-8. They got up to a 3-game win streak mainly due to an obscene amount of turnovers from their opponents. Some fans were too busy basking in the glory of the win streak and crowning Tommy Cutlets as the next Brock Purdy or even Tom Brady, but they did fail to realize that these wins probably costed them a chance at a franchise-saving player. The Giants would finish 2023 at 6-11, a fall from grace considering they were winning a playoff game just a year prior. The Darren Waller investment did not work out, their 7th overall pick from 2022, Evan Neal, looked like a massive bust, and the quarterback they committed so much money to was recovering from an ACL. Despite the injury to Jones, and most people realizing by now the Giants severely overpaid, he still got a vote of confidence from owner John Mara. He touched on Jones' success from 2022 and pretty much alluded to the offensive line being terrible. But John Mara and many higher-ups in the Giants organization always seem to make excuses for Jones rather than look at him for what he actually was. The 2024 offseason ended up making the Giants look like more of a clown show than they were already perceived. This was in large thanks to HBO's Hard Knocks, which featured the Giants front office in a 5-part series, and boy did it look bad at times. The team had some big decisions to make, including Saquon Barkley and safety Xavier McKinney, who were now free agents. McKinney, who was going to cost a lot, ended up leaving for the Packers on a 4-year deal. The Giants showed some interest, but honestly not that much, based on what we could tell. Instead, they decided to allocate that money to a player not even on their roster, as they traded a 2nd and 5th round pick for the rights to acquire edge rusher Brian Burns. Burns is a very good yet not elite player, but the Giants are certainly paying him like an elite player. For Barkley, they could have tagged him for the 2nd year in a row, but decided to let their star running back test the market. On Hard Knocks, owner John Mara stated he'd have trouble sleeping at night if Saquon were to leave and sign with the division rival Philadelphia Eagles. GM Joe Schoen assured him that would not happen when reading a text message saying, "I just got a text that Chicago's driving up the price and Philly's out." Well, hilariously, Saquon ended up signing with the Eagles shortly after and left the Giants stunned. In fairness, Schoen did try to re-sign Barkley multiple times, even during 2022, but they kept coming up a bit short on the guaranteed money. Was it worth losing Barkley over a couple $1,000,000? I bet they regret that decision. To supplement the loss of Barkley, they brought in Devin Singletary, some offensive line help, but still needed the quarterback position to be addressed. With Russell Wilson released by Denver, the Giants hosted Russ on a visit, but apparently would not guarantee him a chance to compete for the quarterback 1 job. So yes, the Giants were still so committed to Daniel Jones, coming off a horrific season, 2 neck injuries, and a torn ACL, yet they told the accomplished quarterback Russell Wilson to go kick rocks. Respectfully, of course. There were always other options like bringing back Tyrod Taylor, but apparently he was turned off when the Giants named Tommy DeVito the starter over him last season. Instead, they gave out a 1-year deal to Drew Lock. Intriguing, of course, but much less of a sure thing than Russ or Tyrod. In the draft, the Giants picked 6th overall, and though they desperately tried trading up to pick number 3, it was to no use. New York found themselves on the board with 3 viable quarterbacks still on the board, but did pass on all 3 in favor of LSU wide receiver Malik Nabers. Nabers was an elite prospect, but given the Giants quarterback room, it meant that year 6 for Daniel Jones was upon us. There were some reports that Drew Lock could push for the starting job, but we all knew it was going to be Jones' job to lose. Late in the offseason, a decision on Darren Waller's future was made as he retired from the NFL to pursue whatever this is. While he only cost them a late 3rd round pick, the price to go out and get Waller was not worth it. With 2024's season beginning, the Giants were given a 6.5 win total. Expectations were pretty low, especially with how bad some of the Giants starters looked during preseason, including Daniel Jones, who made it back from injury. Week 1 wasn't as bad as the year prior when it was 40-0, but it was close, as the Vikings demolished the Giants 28-6. Week 2 would have been a win had they had a healthy kicker, but the Giants decided to play with fire and let an already injured Graham Gano play through an injury, but he left after the first play of the game. And playing that game without a kicker really came back to haunt them, and they dropped to 0-2. After week 5, they did get back to 2-3 with a big win in Seattle. After that though, my goodness, it got bad. and the G-Men lost a franchise record 10 straight games, dropping from 2-3 to 2-13. Plenty happened during that time, including John Mara anticipating he would not make any changes at head coach or GM, but we've seen him say that before and not live up to his word. Daniel Jones got benched for poor performance and days later was outright released, mercifully putting an end to a disastrous era of Giants football. The offensive line, mainly Andrew Thomas, kept breaking down with injuries, and their defense under new defensive coordinator Shane Bowen was unable to create turnovers nor stop anyone in general. As the losses piled on, more and more fingers went from being pointed at Daniel Jones over to Shane and Dable, and many wondered how they can keep their jobs after 2 years of regression. The Giants, who were slated to pick first overall, had a surprising home win late in the season during their final home game, where Drew Lock had one of the better quarterback performances you'll ever see. They would end 2024 going 3-14, meaning that this regime went from 9 wins to 6 wins to 3 wins. Despite that, all reports told us that GM Joe Schoen was safe. He arguably did a worse job than Brian Dable, but John Mara is known to be way more loyal to his general managers. Early on Black Monday, with some people expecting a change at head coach, John Mara released a letter on Giants socials announcing that nobody was getting fired. Despite the bad vibes, signs of incompetence, and bad results, John Mara wanted to keep this duo of Shane and Dable together. Surely he had a good reason for it, right? Well, no, he essentially just didn't want to do the hiring process all over again, mainly because he's been so bad at it in recent years. There were a ton of contradictions by the owner, and plenty of Giants fans rightfully coming away confused and angry with his quotes. One of the bigger takeaways was Mara saying he needs to be in a much better mood a year from now when asked if this regime was on the hot seat. Mike Garfolo later explained that a playoff mandate will be placed on Shane and Dable in 2025. Does this sound familiar at all? If you answered yes, you are correct. Does this not sound like Jerry Reese overspending in 2016 and having it backfire in 2017? Does this not sound like Dave Gettleman overspending in 2021 just to set the team back even more? While Shane did reiterate he has too much respect for ownership to overspend in order to save his job, he can't just expect us to believe him. I've seen this movie play out before, and if the past has taught us anything, he will go out and try to get as many wins as he can in 2025 in order to save his job. It's human nature. After that long summary of how we got here, it looks like Mara and the Giants will repeat some of the same mistakes they already made twice in the last decade. Barring a miracle like 2022, this team's struggles will continue once again next year. Their roster has too many holes, the coaches are average at best, and there's still zero quarterback talent on this roster. As they say, the fish rots from the head down, and there's no better example of that than how the Giants are run. Whether it was the firing of Tom Coughlin while retaining Jerry Reese, the panic hire of McAdoo, the Eli Manning apology tour, the drafting for need and taking Daniel Jones, the belief in Dave Gettleman to understand the modern NFL, the hiring of unqualified Joe Judge, doubling down on Daniel Jones, letting all pro players walk for nothing, and sticking with this regime going backwards after 3 years, it's easy to understand why the results are so bad. This organization has trouble handling the truth. They want to believe everything will be just fine and hope for the best possible outcome, even if it's not a high percentage one. Look at this upcoming season, for example. The chances they flop next year and finish with under 7 wins is significantly higher than executing the playoff mandate. But why can't they see that now? Are we going to force Joe Schoen to draft a quarterback and do to that kid what the Bears did to Justin Fields? They've also been way too loyal to the wrong people. Their overcommitment to late career Eli Manning, Dave Gettleman, and Daniel Jones were absolutely factors into holding this team back. They've also been unlucky with picking high in the wrong quarterback classes. The year they picked 5th and 7th overall, the best quarterback in that draft was Kenny Pickett. In 2020, they had their opportunity to take Tua or Herbert, but they already had Daniel Jones. In 2024, the top 3 quarterbacks they wanted were already taken by the time the Giants picked, thanks to that Tommy DeVito win streak. At the same time, however, it felt like the team used every excuse to defend a bad quarterback in Daniel Jones. Whether it was the fans, the media, or John Mara himself saying, "We've done everything possible to screw this kid up since he's been here. We have certainly not given up on Daniel Jones." And sure, he had rotating coaching staffs, never had an alpha wide receiver, never had a great offensive line, but there was still more than enough evidence to know he was not good in his own right. The organization just had a hard time being honest with itself when honesty was needed. I wish I could say there was a light at the end of the tunnel, but it's hard to see right now. Maybe they get Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders and they up uplift a dead franchise like CJ Stroud and Jaden Daniels have done, or maybe after 2025 they finally hire the right GM and head coach combination, but I'm not getting my hopes up either. It's a shame what happened to this once great franchise, but I guess it could always be worse. But with the rise of Washington, Philly's recent dominance, and Dallas usually being steady, there's no telling how long it'll take to reach their level. As we sit here in the 2025 offseason, the Giants are 40-91-1 since 2017, one of the worst records in all of professional sports during that time. I hope they can get this fixed soon, but I'll have to see it to believe it. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Of course, leave a like and subscribe if you did. Of course, this video took a good amount of time to make, so a like on the video would be much appreciated. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll talk to you guys next time.